Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scott McKay.
Greetings, gentlemen. Welcome to yet another episode of the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. My name is Scott McKay, at Scott McKay on both Twitter and Clubhouse, Real Scott McKay on Instagram. The way to find all the videos is to go to YouTube and search my name, SCOTMCKAY. If you haven't joined the Facebook group yet, gentlemen, you need to go do that right now. It's the Mountaintop Summit on Facebook. There you'll find a like-minded group of virtuous masculine men. And also, as always, the website is www.mountaintoppodcast.com. I am very pleased to let you know today that I have a returning guest who's become a good friend of mine. His name is Gleb Tsipursky, and he is the author of that great book that a lot of you guys got your hands on the last time he was on, called The Blind Spots Between Us. Now, the first time Dr. Tsipursky was on, we talked a lot about blind spots in general. What I did this time was I invited him to come back on and graciously share his wisdom about relationship patterns and the blind spots therein in particular. So the title of this particular episode is Breaking Bad Relationship Patterns. And my guest, of course, Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. Welcome back, Gleb.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you inviting me back on, Scott.
Yeah, definitely, man. You and I think a lot alike in many ways. Of course, you're a world-class expert in this area of blind spots, and that is what you clearly excel at. So I'm looking forward to a great conversation. We went over some of the topics we're going to discuss, which you were pretty excited about, and I have handpicked some of the ones that I think are going to be just super meaningful to these guys. And I think really, man, Gleb, the only thing left to do is dive in. You ready?
Let's dive in. Let's break bad.
For sure. Hopefully, with a little less violence than the TV show.
Hopefully,
fewer
so.
drugs necessary.
Yeah. Sure.
But maybe some really good chicken. We can do pollos hermanos afterwards.
It's a deal.
All right, you got it. Now, listen, the first thing that comes to mind is this, man, seems like what everybody's doing. They get into a relationship for what they can get out of it. I called it self-motivation in what should be a two-way relationship. What is going on with people, Gleb? Why do we think it's such a wise idea? And I mean, it could be just simply a selfish idea, no wisdom attached, right? But why are so many people falling into this trap? Let's just leave it at that, of getting into a relationship that they really just want to get something out of without giving anything in return. What's going on there in our minds?
So when you look into my book, The Blind Spots Between Us, you'll find a cognitive bias, one of these dangerous judgment errors called the self-serving bias. And that just describes who we are. We as human beings, our inherently gut reaction is to be self-serving. So look at kids. When you look at a kid, when you look at a child, when they're growing up, the children are incredibly self-centered. I don't say this pejoratively. I say this descriptively. We have this idea, you shouldn't be self-centered. I'm talking about just who we are. Children are self-centered. They think the world revolves around them, and they want what they want, and they kick and scream until they get it, right? That's what being a child is about. When we grow up, we're taught that that's perhaps not the right way to be. But that's still inherently, intuitively who we are inside. And so when we have not learned to be good partners in a relationship, because we have not had many healthy relationships, we are like children in a relationship because we have not been taught that. So people who have not had many healthy relationships are just like a child. Literally, that's the kind of example you want to be thinking of. They're just like children who think the world revolves around them. And whether it's the man or the woman who has not been in many healthy relationships, they think the relationship should revolve around them and their needs. And they're acting just like a child if they have not been taught how to do things. So that's the self-serving bias. And you'll read more about that in my book and how to address it. But you want to understand that it's being like a child that's the problem. Instead, what you want to be thinking about is, okay, how would an adult behave in this situation? You don't want to be hostile, kind of taking everything you can get in the relationship and it being all about you. You want to be a give and back and forth, compromise, a mutual alliance. Now, that's a much, much better way of thinking about a relationship. An alliance of equal parties where you're giving back and forth and helping each other make the pie bigger rather than taking as much of the pie as possible for yourself. So that's what the dynamic that's going on there. And that's the good framework to think about it.
Yeah, it just seems like immaturity is the opposite of wisdom, which comes about by, learning from life's experiences and filing away what works and what doesn't. That's what makes one wise. And it seems that part of that immaturity that you just discussed involves withholding our true intentions. Like a woman will withhold sex from a guy because she wants a relationship. Or maybe she'll have sex with a guy because she wants a relationship. Men will often promise the relationship when really what he wants is to get laid. And there's a whole lot of dishonesty enveloped in either one of those mindsets, isn't there? And it really doesn't come from a very mature position, let alone a very ethical one, does it?
Yeah, and that's a very sad perspective that when you're talking to someone in a relationship, when you're developing a relationship, you have essentially a hostile intention in mind, a deceitful one, a misleading one. And you know what? The other person can sense it in you many times, at least the ones who have a healthy relationship and who know how to be in a healthy relationship. So you'll find it happens pretty often that the women who are seeking to manipulate the guy will not end up with the best guys.
Go figure.
And the guys who are trying to manipulate the woman will not end up with the best women. And they might end up in a situation which, unfortunately, probably a number of your listeners will end up with when the woman shows up, in 10 months and says, oh, I just had a child and it's yours, and then you're kind of, on the hook and she forgot to use the right sort of birth control. And that is not a risk that you want to be taking on yourself. That is pretty dangerous. So in either case, when it's a woman or a guy who are in a situation where they're manipulating their partner, a good partner, a good mate will sense that. And you're going to end up with what's called survivorship bias. And you'll learn more about that in my book. So on these dangerous judgment errors where we don't see that what survives to get into that relationship are not the best mates. And the people who do not survive to get into that relationship are all the people who are excluded because your attitude comes across. Obviously most of the listeners are guys, maybe there are some women. I've got to tell you, your attitude comes across when you're trying to manipulate someone, and all the good women will not be willing to enter into a relationship with you. And the kind of people you end up in a relationship with will not be the best people. So you want to be thinking about that when you're entering into a relationship with dishonest intentions, that you're going to be taking on much more trouble than is worth with the situation.
It's kind of like being a dishonest or pushy salesperson. You shouldn't expect to be quite as successful as someone who really just wants to help people buy the product that is really good for them.
You're absolutely right. That's a good parallel.
Now, there are several things that have come up here. Before we move on from this idea of being immature, or perhaps not having the life wisdom we should have, a lot of people, even into adulthood, are still acting like seventh graders. They're kind of obsessed over this chick they just met, or even feeling like they're in love with her, when really they're just allowing themselves to get addicted to having sex with her or getting addicted to her personality. There's something unhealthy going on there, and it involves a lot of bias, doesn't it?
Yeah, so when we idolize someone, we put someone on a pedestal, what often happens is this idea of love. And you want to be thinking about what love is. Maybe someone's been in a relationship for a long time, and then they see somebody else and they're like, oh, I'm in love with this person. That's not love. That's infatuation. What you're feeling is infatuated. And that's a feeling going back to our evolutionary origin. So these cognitive biases, the book talks about how everything that we are, our brains are not adapted to the modern environment. Our brains are adapted to the ancient savanna environment. And that very much deeply applies to our reproduction, right? That's a very fundamental evolutionary mechanism. And we have to think about whatever actions we're taking, whatever intuitions we're feeling, those all have an evolutionary background. And sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. But you want to understand that the intuitions, the emotions are coming from an evolutionary background. Now, what's the evolutionary background for this feeling of infatuation? What's the evolutionary background there? Well, it was beneficial for our genes to have as many mates as possible. That was beneficial for our genes to reproduce. So we are driven by that genome. Men are driven to have as much sex with different partners as reasonably possible without going overboard, because women, you have to have some kind of balance with women not wanting to have guys who are going to be cheating all over them, right? So that's bad for evolution. But for evolution, it's good for men to occasionally stray and have as many children as they reasonably can in that situation. Now, that's what our genes are driving us to do, but do you really want to be driven by your genes? Our genes are also telling us to eat as much food as possible, sugary, delicious food as possible, because in the savanna environment, it was very important for us to eat any sugar, honey that we came across, bananas, whatever. Otherwise, we would starve and we wouldn't be able to survive and thrive and reproduce. In the modern environment, that's a very bad idea because we have all this processed food, junk food, and if you try to eat all the sugar you can, you're not going to be in good health. So hopefully the folks listening to this show have figured out how to have a good, healthy diet and exercise, although there's still an obesity epidemic in the United States. Obviously, we haven't all figured out how to do this. In the same way, you figure that out, you have physical fitness, you're going against your intuitions in your diet, in your physical fitness, in your exercise. You need to do the same thing in mental fitness. You need to go against your intuitions in this feeling of infatuation. Just the fact that you're feeling infatuated, that you were feeling addicted to someone's personality, to the desire to have sex with someone, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do for your own goals. And I'm not saying from a normative perspective or morality, but for the goals that you have in life, for the kind of relationships you want to be, for the kind of man you want to be, for the kind of person you want to be as in this modern world. So you want to not simply trust your intuition and say, just because I'm infatuated, I should pursue this relationship. You want to question it. You should realize that infatuation is a result of your genes telling you, I want to reproduce more. Just like they're telling you, eat all these delicious donuts that you can. And in both cases, that may not be the right move for you from a modern civilized perspective. From that primal savage perspective, that's the right move. But from a modern civilized perspective, that may not be the right choice at all.
I'm fascinated that you would align this idea of being obsessed and addicted towards a certain woman with the idea of spreading our seed all over the place. Because on the surface, it seems like what the pickup artist community used to call one-itis. I'm so focused on this one chick, I've got to have her, I'm in love with her. But really, it's kind of a subset of this desire to have sex without anything really being involved otherwise, which is, of course, a primal urge. A prehistoric one. And of course that combined with our primal urge to eat all the sugary foods like honey and sweets or whatever, darned evolution, just contributes to nothing good in our lives long term, especially in postmodernity. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I was reminded of is Alan Carr's famous quote, "You should never meet your heroes." And a lot of guys get obsessed over a certain chick and then they finally meet her and get involved with her and realize that, for every good-looking woman out there, every sexy woman out there is a guy who's already long since sick of her. And so it really is kind of a mental trick we play on ourselves.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point about the mental trick. And the key thing is to remember what happens after you eat a lot of delicious donuts. You don't feel good. Your stomach is full, you're feeling oily, fat, and rich, and you feel guilty about yourself, you feel bad, right? It's the same thing when the pickup artist community, the one-itis, after you have sex with that woman, often the men don't want to have anything to do with her because they accomplished their goals. And it's something we were talking about before the show, the Madonna Whore Complex, that, I'm putting this person on a pedestal. Now that I actually had sex with her, well, whatever. She's no longer on a pedestal. I'm going to go find my next person on the pedestal.
Not a very evolved way to look at it now, is it?
And you can understand, going back to what's happening, that's all genes. Your genes are telling you, you will have the most wonderful thing possible if you have sex with this woman. And now you had sex with this woman and your genes are telling you, okay, now on to your next conquest, because you want to spread your genes around as much as possible. And so that is all coming from your genes. And do you really want to be driven by your genes? Is that the kind of life you want to have? Do you want to be eating everything that you come across and, just trying to get with every woman who you happen to be infatuated with? That may not be the best thing for your life.
Well, what separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom, of course, is the ability to reason. And that
Exactly.
ability to reason is enhanced by the aforementioned wisdom. So
Exactly.
This is all tied to maturity. You talked about the Madonna Whore Complex. Something similar, or a similar dynamic, I should say, is when a guy just dreams of destroying this chick sexually. He just wants to have her so badly he can't stand it. And then she agrees to have sex with him. And then the first thing he thinks is, wait a minute, how many guys is she having sex with?
Mm-hmm.
And she feels slut-shamed by that, puts her clothes back on, slams the door behind her, and the guy's left wondering what happened here. And that, of course, is a cognitive bias. What we think we want isn't what we really want, or at least not under these circumstances. And then we become kind of like that proverbial dog chasing its tail. And that's no good either, is it?
No, absolutely not. So that's, again, we're driven by our genes, and our genes tell us that, okay, we want to have many relationships, many sexual relationships, and part of that driver is to not necessarily keep a good relationship with a woman after we have had sex with her. So that is a very problematic pattern that our genes are indeed driving us to do. And that is question, do you want to just have that primal, natural, native self? Tony Robbins tells you to be primal, be savage. But is that really a good idea? Do you want to be primal and savage, or do you want to be wise and civilized? That's kind of the question you want to ask yourself about how you want to be a man in today's world. I would strongly encourage you to think about, from a relationship perspective, if you want a relationship with people, if you just want sex with people, you can be part of the hookup culture, or, if you don't even want to bother with that, just go and hire a prostitute, right? You'll get sex. But if you want a relationship, that is a terrible way of having a relationship, just trying to pursue your intuitions and emotions and gut reactions and infatuations. Just like it's a terrible way to pursue being healthy and fit, to go to a buffet restaurant and eat everything you want.
Yeah. You were mentioning this idea of making a conscious decision, whether to be primal and just follow our gut instincts and tendencies, or to make a decision to be more evolved and be that kind of man. And I think it's a legitimate question to ask, why should we? Why should we choose the latter? My offering, as far as a realistic reason why, would be because better decisions make for a better life. I mean, you start making bad decisions, and that's when you get back to the woman showing up 10 months later going, surprise, you're the daddy, now pay for this kid that we really didn't plan for together. That's just an example of some of the many bad decisions that can lead to bad results and outcomes. The better your decision making based on better wisdom and a little more evolved self-control, if you will, the better your future is going to be. Just like, I think Jordan Peterson mentions this in his book. He's famously a Simpsons fan. He talks about how Homer Simpson mentions in an episode, this is going to negatively affect the future Homer Simpson. Man, I feel sorry for that guy. Which, of course, is so very Simpsons-esque,
yes.
Right?
It's a very deep insight, wrapped in a in a very amusing statement.
Yes, for sure. But of course, the social commentary is what's made The Simpsons and South Park, such enduring shows year after year, because it just never stops becoming funny. It's just way too ironic. Now, one of the things you mentioned before also is this idea of blaming other people for our own patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And you attributed that to immaturity as well.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of call it the projection of causation. In other words, all women are terrible to me. All women are mean to me. Therefore, it must mean all women are terrible in general. It can't be anything I did. Now, you have a different, more fancy way of describing that bias, so go ahead.
Right. So the scientific name for this is called the ultimate attribution error. And when you'll be reading my book, or again, you can Google all this stuff, this is a cognitive bias. It causes us to misattribute group behaviors to the characteristics of groups we don't like, as opposed to external circumstances or just one person behaving in a certain way. So that is really a fundamental at what's called the ultimate attribution error. It's the absolute attribution error when you think, okay, this is how a group behaves, just based on certain narratives and tropes that are present in the pickup artist community, or the behavior of a couple of members of that group that you happen to dislike. It's discrimination, plain and simple, in other terms. So it's that ultimate attribution error that you have to realize is going on. And this happens with women just as much as men when they think, oh, all guys are jerks. And when men think, oh, all women are manipulative and out to get me, or something like that. That ultimate attribution error is something that really causes a perception of the war between the sexes and fundamental differences. You know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, right? That's a famous book. When you look at what's actually happening with, men are from Mars and women are from Venus, that's BS. The research shows very clearly that there's much more variance within men and within women than there is between men and women. So the characteristics that we can attribute to men, like people who are perceived as assertive and strong and less emotional, more rational, and then women, empathetic, caring, communicative, community-oriented, you'll find that overall there's a slight correlation between being a woman and being empathetic and caring, and being a man and being assertive and adventurous. But there are going to be the most assertive and adventurous woman is going to be much, much more assertive and adventurous than the average man. And the most empathetic and caring man is going to be much, much more empathetic and caring than the average woman. And so the similarities between the sexes are overwhelmingly higher than the differences. The overlap is probably something like 85% or something like that, 80 to 85%. So we are making this very ultimate attribution error when we think women are like this and men are like this. It's completely not true. That's not what the science says. And you really want to be focusing on the science because our intuitions are not to be trusted in this sort of area.
Well, it's like I've always said, there are golden-hearted people and black-hearted people of both genders. And the vast, vast majority of us, unless we're walking on water, are somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. So when the men going their own way crowd comes at me, trying to somehow denigrate what I talk about, my comeback is always, well, listen, let's put the shoe on the other foot. If there's a woman who can't stand men and thinks all men are jerks, what's the likelihood you want to get into a relationship with her? Well, zero if you're a good, decent man with self-respect. But if she's hot, you might definitely have sex with her, but you don't want the relationship. So this woman saying to herself her whole life, men only want one thing. They don't want a relationship. They just want to have sex. Well, yeah, with her. Meanwhile, there's another woman out there who likes men, is sweet, kind-hearted, optimistic, these qualities that men truly are looking for and value if they're looking for a good woman in their lives. And these women, get a guy to ask her to marry them every other week because of the way they are. So what's going on with these men going their own way is they've decided all women are terrible and awful, and they've allowed themselves to get so embittered by it that none of these good women would dare get into a relationship with some guy who doesn't respect or like women. And that's exactly what you're talking about, right?
That's right. That's a survivorship bias, where the women who survive to interact with these men, have sex with these men, get into a relationship, are far from the best women. To be very clear, there are plenty of great women available. And I think this is something that many men don't realize. When you look at the demographics are very clear. Women outnumber men. And there are many more women that are not married than there are women who are married. Increasingly, women are not choosing to marry early, and some don't marry their whole lives. So there are many, many more women available for relationships now than there used to be 10, 20, 30 years ago. And this might be surprising to a number of your listeners who are like, why can't I find the right woman? Well, because you're not researching in the right way. You're not approaching them in the right way. I can guarantee to you, there's very clear numbers showing that there are very many women who are not married, much more than previously throughout the U.S. history. So you want to assume that if you're not finding the right woman, it's not because of them. It's because of you.
Go figure. Now, the pendulum can also swing the other way, can it? I mean, it seems like for every bias, there's an equal and opposite bias, isn't there? It seems like that's a pattern with what you talk about. And the one I want to bring up right now is what's commonly known as Captain Save-A-Ho. Or, yeah, this woman's completely imperfect. Matter of fact, she's really kind of awful. But you know what? Gosh darn it, I'm going to go date her anyway, because deep down she needs a man like me to ride in on my white horse, be her knight in shining armor, and rescue that damsel in distress. A corollary to that is, of course, what is commonly known as missionary dating. It has nothing to do with the missionary position in sex, although it kind of does, I guess, in an ancillary way. But what we mean here is if I'm a devout person and the object of my desire, probably more like lust, is not of the same belief system I am, well, you know what? I'll simply proselytize them. I'll convert them to my way of thinking, and I'll save this person eternally by doing so, and everything will be just great. Everything will be hunky-dory. Well, what's going on with that set of biases, Gleb?
So there are two crucial cognitive biases involved there, which you'll read about in my book. One is called the optimism bias, and that's kind of like it sounds, where...
Yeah, we've talked about that.
Exactly. People who underestimate the likelihood of negative future events, just like guys who underestimate the likelihood that a woman will show up 10 months later and say, he's yours. And the overconfidence effect, the cognitive bias of feeling way too confident about our evaluations of reality. So we are way too confident about ourselves, and a certain proportion, and that applies to both people who are pessimistic, who are too negative about women, and people who are too positive about women. Pessimism bias and optimism bias. So people can be overconfident and pessimistic, and overconfident and optimistic. So the Captain Save-A-Ho is the overconfident and optimistic. So people who are very overconfident about their abilities and their strength, and over-optimistic. The third cognitive bias that I think we haven't talked about yet is called the illusion of control. So the illusion of control applies to the idea that we perceive ourselves to be in much more control of reality and other people and everything in our lives than we actually are. We have to realize that people, by the time we date them, they are not children. They have their whole lives. Somebody's in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, even, or whatever, 50s, 60s. They are already in their 20s. By their 20s, they're already fully formulated adults, pretty much. They're not going to change much. And so you want to assume that the person that you approach is going to change pretty little in response to whatever you're trying to do. They might change a little bit to look more like you over the course of a decade or 2 decades. But you are not going to deeply change that person. Just believe me. You're much better off finding the right person for you and not hoping and praying that they will change, but just assuming that they will stay the way they are, and then figuring out you'll have a much better life, much better relationship, and they'll have a much better life and much better relationship, and you will not be miserable and they will not be miserable.
Well, I think it's a euphemism in that context to refer to that as overconfidence. To me, that sounds like flat out arrogance. And of course, the difference between confidence and arrogance is the former involves us having a strong belief in our own competence, whereas the latter is, I think I'm better than you. And if I believe I'm saved by God Almighty and you're not, that would fall under that umbrella or under that divine canopy. Right? Let's open up our umbrella a little bit wider. Or, Captain Save-A-Ho thinks he has this all-conquering power to rescue any damsel, even if she doesn't frankly feel like being rescued, which is often the case. Along those same lines is, well, for example, wishing someone else into attraction or trying to talk a woman into being attracted. If I could just talk to her, I could get her to come back into my life and love me again and be attractive. If I could just explain to her how I'm better for her, how I make more money, how I have a better college degree, then she'll fall in love with me. And it's this weird conflation of logic and emotion that gets a lot of guys crossed up, isn't it?
Yeah, so we talked about the illusion of control before, and this is definitely featuring here. Another one is called the illusion of transparency, where we perceive the messages that we're sending and our mental states to be much more transparent to other people than is actually the case. So that you're combining those things as well as some problematic emotions and beliefs. Those are the cognitive biases here, the illusion of transparency and the illusion of control. You can read more about those in my book. And the problem with that mindset, of course, is that you're really not going to be able to talk someone into changing their emotions. So why is that? Well, okay, so here is something that I fundamentally talk about as kind of the first chapter in my book, the basic dynamic that's going on within this. We have this system of thinking and feeling called the autopilot system, also called system 1. So the autopilot system is our emotions and intuitions. That's our feelings, all of those gut reactions, infatuation, everything. Then we have another system of thinking called system 2, the intentional system. So in the intentional system is the reasonable, rational system. That system developed much later. It's associated with the prefrontal cortex of the brain. It's much, much, much weaker. Our emotions and intuitions determine the large majority of what we do. That prefrontal cortex, the intentional system, is much, much less strong. So this is something that we need to realize. The emotions and intuitions are much stronger than the rational, reasonable part of ourselves in the moment, in any sort of given moment. Now, over time, the thing about emotions is that they are very short term. So you can develop that wisdom that you very rightly talk about, Scott, over time by using that intentional system to logic yourself into having better beliefs over time, because the intentional system is long-term oriented and goal achieving. But in that moment, when the emotions are there, they are going to be much more powerful. And when you're using reason and logic, what happens is you're not talking to the autopilot system. You're talking to the intentional system. And the intentional system is not going to change someone's emotions. You're not ever going to persuade someone to love you, to have different emotions, that something is good when they feel it's bad. That is not the way human beings work. If you want to shift somebody's emotions, you need to speak to them from an emotional perspective. And it's going to be very hard. It's difficult. It's challenging to do. It can be done if you empathize with someone, show obvious caring, and over time help them realize that their initial emotions were not quite spot on in reaching their own self goals, right? So right now we're talking, and men are listening to the podcast and they're thinking, oh, the way I've been approaching women has been mistaken in some ways. And maybe this way that I've been approaching women that I've been feeling good about is actually not a good way of approaching women. And now they're starting to feel less good about that way of approaching women and thinking about women. And they're like, okay, maybe I need to change my way of approaching women to achieve my actual goals with women. Now, that's the way you change somebody's emotions. Because what's happening is that you're showing them that their tactics to achieve their own goals are not leading them to their goals. That's the way that that's the only realistic way you can change somebody's emotions, not to talk them into loving you or anything like that.
You know, far too many guys believe they can logic women into being attracted to them when attraction is a feeling. Mm-hmm. And David D'Angelo, of course, coined the famous term, attraction is not a choice, which I'd say you've elaborated on quite successfully here. Mm-hmm. But man, I think the meta level truth there is I don't think guys fully grasp how powerful it is to cause a woman to be attracted to you by demonstrating natural masculinity and making her feel safe, because what comes next is the woman helps you park that logic in the proper parking space. She's helping you with the logic from there. Mm-hmm. No, I know you don't have a master's degree like I do, but you're really smart and I'm sure you could get a master's degree. It's almost like they're creating logic on your behalf once you make them feel what they need to feel. And like you said, there's a primal order to things, whether it's healthy or mature or whatever, it's the case. A couple other things I want to get to here as time's running short. And this is related to what you just talked about, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention it. There are a lot of times where we'll kind of go into this cognitive dissonance over something that's going on with the woman who's the object of our desire because we simply don't want to believe it. The example that comes to mind is that a woman goes out on a first date with a guy and he says, I don't ever want to get married. I don't want to have any children. And then a year later, she thinks he's a jerk. This guy won't marry me and he won't have any children. It's like, well, he told you that already, but you just weren't trying to hear that. And I think a lot of times, we'll excuse major faults in women because she's got a nice ass or because we haven't had a girlfriend in a long time. And I would say, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, because I'm sure you have some elaborative thoughts here, is to me, it seems like a fear of loss. It seems like we're coming from a poverty mentality. We know this woman isn't right for us. We know that we deserve better. And we know she'll probably never become the woman we need her to be. But because we don't have any other options, we're holding our hand pretty close.
So that's definitely happening in some cases. I think what you're talking about in terms of when a woman gets together with a guy or a guy gets together with a woman and the woman or the guy says that I don't want to have any children or something to that effect, then over time, the person might ignore the statement at first or think, okay, I'll just have a short-term relationship. I'm not going to care about children. Over time, other things click and let's say talking about the woman, and the woman feels like, oh, the guy is great and she likes dating him and he makes her feel safe and all of that stuff. And then she kind of forgets. You forget in your mind the thing that the person told you early on, where it was a kind of precondition of the relationship. And what happens is called the false consensus effect. We greatly, and that's what some of the things I talk about in my book, we greatly overestimate the extent to which those who are in a relationship with us share the same beliefs that we do. We feel that because we want to have children, other people should want to have children. We feel that because somebody, wants a certain lifestyle, or wants to live somewhere warm, and they should move with us to a warm climate, even though they like it here and their families here. Or they feel, job is important, and we feel, well, we should be the most important thing in their lives, but the job is the most important thing in their lives, and they told you that. And then you're shocked when they get a new offer somewhere in Europe, and they are like moving there, and like, what are you talking about? Well, okay, my job is the most important thing to me. So that's the false consensus effect. When we underestimate the extent to which other people with whom we're in a relationship, our mates, have the same beliefs and preferences that we do. And so we think ourselves into this very dangerous state. And that's what you'll see a lot of conflicts and tensions about, where people enter a relationship with kind of, maybe holding their nose, like you said, but then they forget that they were holding their nose, and issues come up later in the relationship when they're already been 6 months in the relationship, that reminds them of why they were holding their nose in the first place when they were entering the relationship, but they kind of conveniently forget that. So the false consensus effect is something that causes a lot of trouble in the mid-relationship stage. So that's something to be really think. It's not something that's a big issue in the short term, but in the medium term, after a couple of months, that develops into a very serious problem. So you want to be very careful about assuming that the woman that you're in a relationship with has the same beliefs, preferences, and predispositions that you do. You want to note these areas of difference and carefully make sure that they are not going to be a relationship deal breaker for you, first of all, and or negotiate and compromise around them so that they don't become major issues going forward.
Yeah, a classic example that I think really illustrates this particular bias you're talking about is my candidate should have won this election 100 million to nothing.
Sure.
That just doesn't exist in the real world. You can't get everybody to agree on anything.
Yep.
But in these situations, I guess in all fairness, there are certain men who say that they don't want to get married and they don't want to have any kids. Then they meet the right woman, and then lo and behold, 6 months, a year passes, and indeed he has come around to the woman's way of thinking and wants to get married and have kids. And that may very well happen, but the bias and the cognitive error on the woman's part was the assumption that was going to happen from minute one. So I wanted to be perfectly clear about that.
Yes, that's the assumption. I think it's also the problem that these are the kinds of men who are much, much more vulnerable to a midlife crisis and abandoning their kids and children, at some stage, 5-10 years down the road. And the woman will be in a much worse spot later onward because she didn't realize that that's something that might very well happen, that the person's underlying intuitions will eventually lead them to make bad decisions. Yep.
And that, of course, brings us full circle to this idea of not having the wisdom to match your emotions.
That's right.
That's sure. Right. His name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. He is the author of The Blind Spots Between Us. And you can pick up a copy of that by going to my Amazon influencer page, which you can find at mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon. I'll put Gleb's books at the top of that once again, since he's our most recent guest. And also, when you go to mountaintoppodcast.com/Gleb, Gleb, you'll be teleported instantaneously to Gleb's website. And Gleb, what will they find when they get there?
They'll find the page for the book where they can download a free sample, check out some videos about it, some more information about it, and they'll check out the website more broadly. There's a number of courses on making good decisions and managing risks in the relationship and in other areas. There's books about that in other areas, so not simply in relationships, but in business and your professional, personal life, all of that sort of stuff. You can check out coaching. So I offer coaching on these topics and just blogs and video casts and podcasts about these topics.
Fantastic. As always, Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, a crowd favorite around here. Always fantastic information that challenges us and we can put to good use. So thanks, Gleb, for joining us. Hope you'll come back again.
Appreciate it, Scott. Thank you very much for inviting me.
For sure, man. For sure. It's been a great show. Gentlemen, if you haven't been to mountaintoppodcast.com lately, go check it out. Download a free copy of my book, Sticking Points Solved. It covers just about any situation you can think of in dating or relationships. If you're a guy who's interested in women at all, you should be interested in downloading a copy of that book. It's there for you at mountaintoppodcast.com. When you do so, you'll be signed up to get my daily newsletter. It's fluff free and will give you various ways that you can get better with women, be a better man. Also, if you haven't talked to me yet for 25 minutes for free, my schedule is open to you. If it takes a little bit more than 25 minutes to give you something that's actionable that you can use right now to be a better man and get better with women, hey, you know what? We'll do that. That's there for you at mountaintoppodcast.com. Gentlemen, master classes are underway. We're going to get started with the first one here really shortly. We have polled you guys and asked you what topics are important to you. If you have not done that just yet, you can go to mountaintoppodcast.com/survey and get you some and tell me what you think. And we will be hanging out together live once a month to nail down expertise, mastery in a topic of your choosing. And you can look forward to those. It's all there for you when you visit mountaintoppodcast.com. And I will look forward to seeing you guys on those master classes. Once again, go to mountaintoppodcast.com/survey to get in on that and tell me what you think. And last but certainly not least, I want to let you in on what's going on with our sponsors, which include Origin in Maine and also HeroSoap.com. Both of those generous sponsors to our show are going to make you look great, feel great. And I'll tell you what, if you have not gotten yourself a couple pair of Origin's jeans yet, you need to drop everything and do that. They will be the best looking, best fitting, longest lasting jeans you have ever had. Hero Soap, you need to get you some of that body wash and hide it in the shower and make sure you use it the next time one of your female friends comes over. Take a shower with a woman just once using that particular substance and you will thank me. I promise. Both of our sponsors will honor the coupon code MOUNTAIN10 with any purchase. Check them both out. I've just scratched the surface with the great offerings from both Origin in Maine and Hero Soap, and you can check them both out at mountaintoppodcast.com. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scott McKay from X&Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X&Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes, And while you're there, sign up for the free X and Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.